Sometimes the most broken souls find each other in the darkest places. Sometimes a single act of unexpected kindness can awaken something we thought was lost forever. In a forgotten borderland town, an ancient vampire named Kal has walked among mortals for 800 years, taking what he needs and feeling nothing. But when he arrives at a crude auction block, he sees Elira, a pregnant woman, abandoned by everyone she's ever known. The auctioneer calls her damaged goods, but Kal sees quiet strength that refuses to break. In a moment that surprises even him, he claims her not as property, but as something more. He takes her to his mountain castle, where centuries of silence have made him forget what it means to care. As Elira prepares to give birth, something begins to change between them. Her courage awakens feelings he buried long ago. But when villagers whisper of curses being broken and hunters close in, Kal faces an impossible choice. What happens when love becomes the one thing even an immortal cannot protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plaza of Valdris, a forgotten settlement clinging to existence where three kingdoms met, but none claimed responsibility. Here, in this lawless borderland, human dignity had become a commodity as scarce as clean water. The wooden platform at the center of the square bore the stains of countless desperate transactions, where families sold their children, debtors traded their freedom, and the unwanted found themselves measured by their ability to work until death. Kal moved through the gathering crowd like a shadow given form. 8 centuries of existence had taught him to blend seamlessly among mortals, his pale features and dark clothing unremarkable in a place where everyone carried secrets. The ancient signet ring on his finger, weathered silver bearing a family crest, long forgotten by history, caught no light, as if even the sun refused to acknowledge what he had become. He had not come to this wretched place seeking sustenance. His kind required blood, yes, but he had learned long ago to take what he needed without ceremony from those who would not be missed. No, something else had drawn him here. A whisper carried on the wind from his mountain stronghold, a rumor that spoke of desperate souls and broken lives being bartered like cattle. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Corvus, with gold teeth that glinted when he smiled, climbed onto the platform with the practiced ease of someone who had never questioned the morality of his profession. Behind him, a line of chained figures waited in the morning, heat thieves working off debts, orphans with no other prospects, and those whose only crime had been trusting the wrong people. "Good people of Valdris," Corvus called out, his voice carrying the false cheer of a merchant hawking spoiled meat. "Today we have prime offerings for those with coin and the wisdom to see opportunity where others see burden." Kal positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, his heightened senses cataloguing every heartbeat, every nervous breath. He had witnessed such scenes countless times over the centuries, had even participated when his nature demanded it. But something felt different today, though he could not yet name what. The first few sales proceeded as expected. A young man, strong-backed and desperate, went to a merchant needing laborers for his caravan. Twin girls, barely 16, were claimed by a brothel keeper whose intentions needed no explanation. Each transaction was completed with the efficiency of cattle trading, money changing hands, while lives were reshaped by forces beyond their control. Then she was brought forward. Elira moved with careful steps, her swollen belly making the simple act of climbing onto the platform a challenge. Her hands were bound, but her spine remained straight, her chin lifted in quiet defiance of her circumstances. The faded blue shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her only remaining possession, had seen better days, but she wore it like royal silk. Kal felt something stir within him that he had not experienced in centuries. It was not hunger, not the predatory instinct that had sustained him through endless nights of hunting. This was something older, something from the life he had lived before death claimed him and transformed him into a creature of shadows and blood. "Now, here's an interesting piece," Corvus announced, his tone suggesting he was presenting damaged goods rather than a human being. Young, healthy despite her condition, and clearly accustomed to hard work. Notice the calluses on her hands. This one knows how to earn her keep. The crowd murmured among themselves, most turning away when they noticed her pregnancy. In a place where every mouth to feed was a burden, a woman about to bring another life into the world represented double the cost for uncertain return. But Kyle found himself stepping closer, drawn by something he could not yet understand. Elira's eyes swept the crowd, not with the desperate pleading he had expected, but with the steady gaze of someone taking the measure of her potential captors. When her gaze found his, she did not look away. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of time, two souls recognized something in each other across the impossible gulf that separated mortal from monster. "She carries a child, yes," Corvus continued, warming to his pitch, despite the obvious lack of interest from most potential buyers. "But think of it as getting two for the price of one. Train them right from the start, and you'll have loyal servants for life." A farmer near the front of the crowd spat in the dust. "Who'd want the burden of a pregnant woman? By the time she's useful again, you've fed her for months and got nothing in return. Probably cursed, or worse." Kyle felt an unfamiliar anger rise in his chest at their casual cruelty. He had spent centuries viewing mortals as little more than cattle himself, yet something about their dismissal of this woman's worth struck him as profoundly wrong. Elira's story, as Kyle would learn later, was one of quiet tragedy rather than scandal. She had been married to a young craftsman in a village 2 days' journey north, a good man who had loved her truly and planned to build them a life of simple contentment. But fever had taken him before their child could be born, and his family, already struggling to survive, had seen her pregnancy as a burden they could not afford. They had not cast her out with cruelty, but with the cold calculation of people who had learned that sentiment was a luxury they could not afford. They had given her a donkey, some meager supplies, and directions to Valdris, where they claimed she might find work, or at least charity. What they had not told her was that by the time she arrived, exhausted and with nowhere else to turn, she would be desperate enough to sell herself just for the promise of food and shelter. "Do I hear any bids?" Corvus called out, though his voice carried less enthusiasm now. "Surely someone sees the value here. Look at her strong bones, good breeding, clearly knows her place." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Even in a place where human lives were bought and sold like livestock, a pregnant woman represented complications that most buyers preferred to avoid. Kyle found himself stepping forward before he had consciously decided to move. "I'll take her." The words surprised him as much as they did the crowd. Several people turned to stare at the pale stranger who had appeared among them like morning mist. Corvus's eyes lit up with the sudden hope of completing a sale that had seemed destined for failure. "Ah, a gentleman of vision," the auctioneer proclaimed. "I can see you understand quality when you see it. Shall we say 50 silver pieces?" It was a pittance, an insult disguised as a price. Kyle had carried more coin than that in his purse for centuries, wealth accumulated from ages of taking what he needed from those who no longer had use for it. But he sensed that arguing the price would only draw unwanted attention to himself. "Agreed," he said simply, producing the coins with smooth efficiency. Elira watched this exchange with an expression that mixed relief with wariness. She had hoped for someone to claim her. The alternative was a slow death from exposure and starvation. But this stranger with his pale skin and dark eyes was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. There was something ancient about him, something that spoke of depths she could not fathom. As Kyle approached the platform to complete the transaction, their eyes met again. This time, he saw no fear in her gaze, despite the obvious strangeness of her situation. Instead, He saw the kind of quiet strength that had sustained her through loss and abandonment, the same strength that would soon challenge everything he thought he knew about his own nature. "What name shall I record for the transfer?" Corvus asked, his quill poised over a ledger that had seen countless such transactions. Kyle hesitated for a moment. He had used many names over the centuries, identities adopted and discarded as easily as changes of clothing. But something about this moment felt different, more significant than a simple purchase of human property. Kyle, he said finally, using a name he had not spoken aloud in decades. It had been his true name once, in the life before, when he had been mortal and young and believed that love could conquer any darkness. The transaction was completed with surprising swiftness. Papers were signed, coins changed hands, and suddenly Elira found herself bound by law and custom to a stranger who had claimed her for reasons she could not begin to guess. As Kyle helped her down from the platform, his touch surprisingly gentle, for someone who moved with such predatory grace, she felt the first stirring of hope she had experienced in weeks. Perhaps this pale stranger would prove to be salvation rather than another form of bondage. Perhaps the child growing within her would have a chance at life after all. Or perhaps she was simply trading one form of desperation for another, exchanging the slow death of abandonment for whatever fate awaited her in the hands of a man whose very presence seemed to whisper of secrets better left unspoken. As they walked away from the auction block together, master and servant by law, but something more complex in reality, neither could have imagined how profoundly this simple transaction would transform them both. Kyle had thought he was purchasing a soul to add to his collection of regrets. Instead, he had taken the first step toward reclaiming his own. The sun climbed higher over Valdris as the crowd dispersed, most forgetting the strange pale man and his unexpected purchase before they had even reached their homes. But in the mountains that rose like ancient guardians beyond the town's dusty borders, an abandoned castle waited in silence, ready to witness a transformation that would challenge the very nature of what it meant to be human or monster. The journey into the mountains began in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on the rocky path, and Elira's occasional sharp intake of breath as the child within her shifted restlessly. Ka'el had provided her with a gentle mare, one of 3 horses he had somehow procured in the time it took her to gather her meager possessions, which consisted of nothing more than the faded blue shawl and a small bundle of herbs she had managed to preserve from her former life. As they climbed higher into the wilderness, leaving the dusty streets of Valdris far below, Elira found herself stealing glances at her mysterious benefactor. He rode with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle, yet there was something otherworldly about his movements, as if he existed slightly apart from the natural world around them. His pale skin seemed to drink in the mountain shadows rather than reflect the afternoon sunlight, and when he turned to check on her well-being, his dark eyes held depths that spoke of experiences far beyond mortal understanding. "How much farther?" she asked, as they paused beside a mountain stream to rest the horses. The climb had been steady but not punishing, yet her condition made even gentle exertion exhausting. "Not far now," Kyle replied, his voice carrying an accent she could not place, something that might have been noble once but had been worn smooth by centuries of use. He helped her down from her mount with careful hands, as if she were made of precious glass rather than flesh and bone. "The castle lies just beyond that ridge." Castle. The word hung between them like a promise and a threat. Elira had grown up in a world where castles were the domain of lords and legends, places of power that common folk glimpsed only from a distance. Yet this man spoke of his castle as casually as another might mention a cottage or farmhouse. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, accepting the cup of cool water he offered her. "When someone claims a person at auction, it's usually for labor, or worse. You've shown me more kindness in these few hours than I've known in weeks." Kyle turned away, ostensibly to check their surroundings, but Elira sensed discomfort in his posture. Perhaps your expectations were too low. Perhaps your motivations are more complex than you're willing to admit. The observation surprised them both with its directness. Elira had not meant to probe so boldly, but something about this strange man invited honesty. There was a loneliness about him that resonated with her own isolation, a sense that he too had been cast adrift from everything familiar and safe. When they resumed their journey, the path became steeper and more treacherous. Ancient pines pressed close on either side, their branches forming a canopy so thick that the afternoon light filtered through in scattered golden coins. The air grew thin and sharp with the promise of snow, despite the season being too early for winter's true arrival. Then the iron gates came into view, and Elira's breath caught in her throat. They rose from the mountainside like the bones of some primordial beast, twisted metal worked into patterns that hurt to look at directly. Rust had claimed much of their surface, leaving stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood in the fading light. These were not gates meant to welcome visitors, they were barriers designed to keep the world at bay. "My home," Kyle said simply, though there was something in his voice that might have been apology. As they approached, the massive gates swung open without any visible mechanism, moving in perfect silence despite their obvious age and decay. Elira's mare shied at the sight, sensing something wrong in a way that only animals could, but Kael's mount passed through without hesitation, as if returning to familiar stable. Beyond the gates lay a courtyard that might once have been magnificent. Cracked stone fountains stood dry and empty, their carved figures worn smooth by decades of mountain weather. Weeds pushed through gaps in the flagstones, and ivy had claimed much of the surrounding walls, giving the entire space the appearance of a garden reclaimed by wilderness. But it was the castle itself that truly stole Elira's breath. The structure rose from the mountainside like something carved from shadow and stone, its towers reaching toward the darkening sky with architectural ambitions that defied practical purpose. Windows stared down at them like hollow eyes, most dark and empty, though a few flickered with the warm light of candles or oil lamps. The main entrance was framed by pillars that might have been lifted from the ruins of ancient temples, supporting an archway carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance when viewed directly. "How long have you lived here?" Elira asked, as Kyle helped her down from her horse once again. "Longer than you might think," he replied, leading both horses toward what appeared to be a stable built into the castle's foundation. "This place has been my sanctuary for many years." Sanctuary. The word carried weight when spoken in such surroundings. This was not a home in any conventional sense. It was a fortress built to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. As they walked toward the main entrance, their footsteps echoing off ancient stone, Elira could not shake the feeling that she was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The great doors, oak banded with iron and carved with the same disturbing symbols that adorned the archway, opened at Kael's touch to reveal a hall that took Elira's breath away. Soaring ceilings disappeared into shadow above, supported by pillars that could have held up cathedrals. Tapestries hung along the walls, their rich colors faded but still magnificent, depicting scenes of hunting and celebration from ages long past. Yet for all its grandeur, the hall felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of furniture or people. This was the emptiness of a place that had forgotten how to be lived in, where silence had grown so thick it seemed to muffle even their breathing. "You live here alone?" Elira asked, her voice small in the vast space. Kyle nodded, leading her toward a staircase that curved gracefully upward into the castle's upper reaches. "Solitude has its advantages. No one to disappoint, no one to lose." The sadness in his voice was so profound that Elira felt her heart contract with unexpected sympathy. Whatever this man's story, it was written in loneliness and regret, carved into the very stones of his mountain fortress. As they climbed the stairs together, her hand trailing along a banister worn smooth by countless other hands over the centuries, She began to understand that she had not been brought here to serve a master, but to accompany a soul as lost and abandoned as her own. "I'll prepare rooms for you in the Eastern Tower," Kyle said as they reached a landing lit by flickering torches. "You'll have privacy there, and comfort. The view of the valley is particularly beautiful at sunrise. And what do you expect of me in return?" The question had to be asked, though Elira dreaded the answer. Kyle stopped walking and turned to face her fully for the first time since they had entered his domain. In the torchlight, his features seemed both ancient and young, marked by experiences she could not fathom, yet somehow innocent of the cruelties she had learned to expect from men with power over others. "I expect nothing," he said finally. "You are here because you needed sanctuary, and I have more than enough space to share. When your child is born and you are strong enough to leave, you may go wherever you wish with my blessing and whatever help I can provide." It was not the answer she had expected, and it left her more confused than relieved. Men did not claim women at auction out of pure charity, especially not men with castles and secrets written into their very bones. Yet the sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, even if the motivations behind it remained hidden. As Kyle showed her to the chambers that would be hers, rooms that had clearly been hastily prepared, but were nonetheless more luxurious than any she had ever occupied, Elira found herself wondering what manner of man she had bound. Herself too. He was dangerous. That much was certain. The way he moved, the casual authority with which he commanded even inanimate objects like gates and doors, spoke of power that extended far beyond mere wealth. But he was also, she sensed, profoundly alone. And in that loneliness, she recognized something of herself, something that spoke to the part of her that had been cast out and abandoned by those who should have offered protection. Perhaps, in this castle of shadows and secrets, two lost souls might find something approaching peace. Or perhaps she had simply traded one form of captivity for another, more subtle and therefore more dangerous. Only time would tell which interpretation proved correct. The Eastern Tower rooms exceeded any comfort Elira had ever known. Tapestries warmed stone walls that might otherwise have felt cold and forbidding, while a fireplace large enough to stand in provided both heat and dancing light that made shadows seem friendly rather than threatening. The bed was carved from dark wood and draped with fabrics so fine they seemed to flow like water beneath her fingers. Yet for all their luxury, the rooms felt like they had been waiting empty for decades, prepared for a guest who had never arrived. On her second morning in the castle, Elira woke to find a simple breakfast waiting on the table by the window: fresh bread, cheese that tasted of mountain grass, and fruit she had not seen since her village days. Kyle himself was nowhere to be found, though she had heard his footsteps in the corridors during the night, restless movements that spoke of someone for whom sleep brought no peace. Her pregnancy made extended rest uncomfortable, so she took to exploring the vast castle during the daylight hours. Each corridor revealed new wonders and new mysteries. There was a library with more books than she had imagined existed in the entire world, their leather bindings speaking of knowledge gathered across centuries. A music room held instruments from dozens of cultures, some familiar, others so exotic she could not guess how they might produce sound. But it was in the castle's highest tower that she made the discovery that would haunt her dreams. The narrow stairs wound upward far longer than seemed possible, as if the tower stretched toward heaven itself. At the summit, a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, revealing a chamber bathed in natural light from windows that looked out over the entire mountain range. And there, in the center of the circular room, sat a cradle. It was a masterwork of craftsmanship, carved from some golden wood and adorned with figures that seemed to dance in the shifting light. Roses and vines twined around its edges, while small animals, rabbits, deer, birds, played eternal games among carved leaves that looked real enough to rustle in an unseen breeze. But what struck Elira most profoundly was the love that had clearly gone into its creation. Every detail spoke of anticipation, of joy, of someone preparing for new life with all the hope and tenderness that parenthood could inspire. Yet the cradle sat empty, covered in the fine dust that spoke of years, perhaps decades, of abandonment. Whatever child it had been meant to hold had never arrived, or had been lost in ways too painful to contemplate. "I wondered when you would find your way here." Kael's voice from the doorway made her start. She had been so absorbed in the cradle's silent story that she had not heard his approach, despite the creaking floors that usually announced movement throughout the castle. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, stepping back from the cradle as if she had been caught trespassing. "I was exploring, and the stairs seemed to call me upward. I didn't mean to intrude on something private." "You're not intruding." Kael entered the chamber slowly, his eyes fixed on the cradle with an expression that mixed longing with something that might have been regret. "This room was always meant for a child. Perhaps it's fitting that you should be the one to find it." Elira watched his face carefully as he approached the cradle, noting the way his hands trembled slightly before he clasped them behind his back. Whose child? The question hung in the air between them like morning mist, delicate and easily dispersed. For a long moment, Kael said nothing, his gaze lost in memories she could not share. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Mine, or so I hoped, once upon a time. I carved this myself, back when I still believed that love could conquer any darkness." "What happened?" Kael's laugh held no humor, only the bitter knowledge of dreams destroyed by reality. "What always happens when creatures like me reach for things meant for the living. The darkness won." Before Elira could ask what he meant by creatures like me, Kael had already turned to leave. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders bowed, as if carrying an invisible weight, made her reach out instinctively. "Kael, wait!" He stopped but did not turn around, and Elira found herself speaking to his back, addressing the man she was beginning to glimpse beneath the mystery and shadows. "I don't know what you are, or what you've done. I don't know what darkness you think you carry. But I do know that someone who could carve such love into wood, who could create something so beautiful in anticipation of new life, cannot be entirely lost to whatever shadows haunt him." This time, when Kael turned, his eyes held a vulnerability she had not seen before. In that moment, he looked not like the mysterious lord of a mountain castle, but like a man who had forgotten what hope felt like and was afraid to remember. "You don't understand what you're saying? Then help me understand." The simple request seemed to break something open in Kael's carefully constructed defenses. He looked at her truly, looked as if seeing her not as the pregnant woman he had claimed at auction, but as a person whose opinion might actually matter. "I am not the man you think I am," he said quietly. "I have done things, terrible things, that would make you flee this place in horror if you knew their true nature. And yet, you brought me here. You've shown me nothing but kindness. You've asked nothing of me but to accept sanctuary when I needed it most." Elira moved closer, her hand coming to rest on the edge of the beautiful cradle. "Whatever you were before, whatever you've done, this room tells a different story. This cradle speaks of someone who knows how to love." Kael closed his eyes as if her words caused him physical pain. "That man died a long time ago. Did he? Or did he just forget how to live?" The question seemed to echo in the circular chamber, bouncing off stone walls and settling into Kael's bones like a challenge he was not sure he was ready to meet. When he opened his eyes again, Elira saw something there that had not been present before, a flicker of possibility, small and fragile as a candle flame in winter wind. "The child you carry," he said finally. "When is it expected?" "Soon. Within the month, I think, though without a midwife to examine me I cannot be certain." Kael nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the cradle. "Perhaps it's time this room served its intended purpose." The offer was made quietly, almost hesitantly, But Elira heard the profound significance behind the simple words. He was not merely offering the use of furniture, he was opening a door to possibilities that neither of them had dared to voice. "Are you certain?" she asked. "This place clearly holds memories that are precious to you." "Precious and painful," Kyle agreed. "But perhaps it's time for new memories to be made. Perhaps it's time to remember that love, no matter how buried, never truly dies." As they stood together in the tower room, surrounded by carved roses and dancing animals, both felt something shift in the air between them. It was not love, not yet, but it was the recognition that love might be possible. For Elira, it was the first time since her husband's death that the future seemed to hold promise rather than merely survival. For Kyle, it was the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart, a wall that had protected him from pain, but also from the possibility of redemption. Neither spoke of the change, but both felt it, fragile and new as the life growing within Elira's womb. In the days that followed their conversation in the tower, Elira began to transform the ancient castle in ways both subtle and profound. It started with small things, gathering wildflowers from the mountain slopes to place in the empty rooms, humming old songs while she worked to fill the oppressive silence that had reigned for decades. But her most ambitious project took root behind the castle's main structure, where a patch of neglected earth caught the morning sun. The herb garden began as necessity. Elira's pregnancy had brought with it the usual discomforts, nausea that struck without warning, aches that settled deep in her bones, and an exhaustion that seemed to leach the strength from her limbs. She had learned healing from her mother and grandmother before her, simple remedies that could ease suffering when properly applied. But the castle's vast stores held no fresh herbs, only preserved foods and wine that spoke of a household that had long ago stopped caring for the living. Kyle found her on her knees in the dirt one afternoon, her hands dark with soil as she carefully planted seeds saved from her old life. He had taken to watching her from shadows and doorways, fascinated by her ability to bring warmth to spaces that had known only cold emptiness for longer than most mortals lived. "The ground will be hard," he said, announcing his presence rather than continuing to observe in secret. "Nothing has grown there for many years." Elira looked up, shading her eyes against the sun that seemed to avoid touching Kyle's pale features. "Hard ground can be softened with patience and care. My grandmother used to say that the earth never truly forgets how to nurture life. It only needs to be reminded." Kyle approached slowly, as if the sight of new growth might prove harmful to him. "What are you planting?" "Chamomile, for calming nerves and easing sleep. Ginger for the nausea that plagues me each morning. Lavender for its scent and for healing." She gestured to each small mound of earth as she spoke, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who understood the ancient partnership between human and plant. "And mint, because its taste reminds me of home." Something in her voice when she spoke the last word made Kyle's chest tighten unexpectedly. Home, such a simple concept, yet one he had not contemplated in centuries. His castle was a fortress, a sanctuary, a prison of his own making, but it had never been home. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the tools she had fashioned from kitchen implements and wood found in the castle's storage rooms. Elira's surprise was evident, but she nodded and moved aside to give him room. Kyle knelt beside her in the dirt, his dark clothing and pale skin making him seem like a shadow-given substance in the afternoon light. His hands, when he took up the crude gardening tools, moved with surprising gentleness. "I had a garden once," he said quietly, breaking the earth with careful strokes. "Roses, mostly. My mother loved roses." It was the first time he had mentioned family, and Elira sensed the significance of the revelation. She worked beside him in companionable silence, occasionally offering guidance about spacing or depth, but mostly just sharing the simple pleasure of working toward new growth. "How long ago?" she asked, when the silence felt ready to hold more words. Kael's hands stilled for a moment, and Elira saw him counting years in his mind, so many years that the number seemed to cause him pain. Longer than you might believe possible. Long enough that I had forgotten the pleasure of making things grow rather than watching them die. The sadness in his voice was so profound that Elira found herself reaching out to touch his hand before she could stop herself. His skin was cold beneath her palm, cold in a way that had nothing to do with mountain air or autumn's approach. But he did not pull away, and in that moment of connection, both felt something shift between them. "Death is not the only ending," Elira said softly. "Sometimes it's just a different kind of beginning." Kael looked at her then, truly looked, and saw not the desperate woman he had claimed at auction, but someone whose strength ran deeper than he had imagined. She had lost husband, home, and family, yet here she knelt in foreign soil, planting seeds with hands that still believed in tomorrow. "You speak as someone who knows loss," he said. "I speak as someone who knows that love doesn't end when life does. My husband is gone, but the love we shared lives on in here." She touched her swollen belly. "And in the way he taught me to see goodness even in dark places." They worked until the sun began to sink behind the mountain peaks, their hands growing dirty together as they prepared the small plot for new life. When they were finished, the garden looked like nothing more than disturbed earth, marked by small stakes. But to both it represented something far more significant, the possibility that growth could happen even in the most unlikely places. As they walked back toward the castle together, Elira felt a sharp pain lance through her lower back. She stopped, one hand reaching out to steady herself against Kael's arm, the other pressed to her side. "What is it?" Kael's voice carried a note of alarm that surprised them both with its intensity. "Just the child shifting," Elira said, though the pain had been sharper than any she had experienced before. "It happens more frequently now." Kael's concern was evident in the way he hovered beside her, clearly wanting to help, but uncertain how. "Should you not be resting? Surely this work is too strenuous in your condition." Elira smiled at his awkward gallantry. "Women have been working and bearing children since the beginning of time. I'm stronger than I look." "I have no doubt of that," Kael said quietly. "But perhaps I worry because strength and invulnerability are not the same thing." The admission revealed more about his character than hours of conversation might have. Here was a man, or whatever he truly was, who had learned to fear loss, who had suffered enough to understand that even the strongest could be broken by forces beyond their control. "Then perhaps you could help me prepare a birthing chamber," Elira suggested as they entered the castle's main hall. "If the child comes early, I'll need more than good intentions to see us both safely through." Kael nodded immediately. "Tell me what you need." And so began another phase of their unlikely partnership. Over the following days, they worked together to transform one of the Eastern Tower's lower rooms into a space suitable for childbirth. Kael proved surprisingly knowledgeable about practical matters, though he deflected questions about how he had acquired such diverse skills. Clean linens appeared as if by magic, along with supplies Elira had not even thought to request. More importantly, their shared labor began to break down the careful distance Kael had maintained since bringing her to the castle. She began to see past his mysterious exterior to glimpses of the man he had been, or perhaps could be again. And he, in turn, found himself remembering what it felt like to care for another's welfare, to plan for a future that extended beyond his own solitary existence. Neither spoke of the change happening between them, but both felt it growing like the tender shoots that would soon emerge from their carefully tended garden. The nightmares began 3 weeks into Elira's stay at the castle. They would wake her, in the depths of darkness, her heart racing with terror that had no clear source, leaving her gasping and disoriented in the unfamiliar luxury of her chamber. On the 3rd such night, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and ventured into the corridors, seeking the comfort of movement when sleep refused to return. That was when she discovered that Kyle, too, was a creature of the night hours. She found him in the great hall, seated before the massive fireplace with a goblet of wine that caught the firelight like captured blood. He had removed his usual dark jacket, and in the flickering light she could see that his white shirt was open at the collar, revealing skin that seemed to glow with its own pale luminescence. His dark hair, usually perfectly controlled, fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I didn't mean to disturb you," Elira said softly, though she made no move to leave. Kyle looked up, and she saw that his eyes held the same restless quality that had driven her from her bed. "The night hours have always been my domain. It's I who should apologize for claiming the common areas when you might need them. The castle is large enough for both our sleeplessness, I think." He smiled at that, the first genuine expression of amusement she had seen from him. "Indeed it is. Please join me. The fire is warm, and solitary brooding loses its appeal after the first century or two." Elira settled into the chair across from him, noting how the firelight seemed to dance across his features in ways that emphasized his otherworldly quality. Yet she felt no fear, only a growing curiosity about the man who spoke of centuries as others might mention seasons. "Do you often have trouble sleeping?" she asked. "Sleep and I have a complicated relationship," Kyle replied, taking a measured sip of his wine. "There are memories that surface in the dark hours, things I've spent considerable effort trying to forget. Yet here you sit, courting those very memories by firelight." Kyle's laugh held no humor. "You're remarkably perceptive." "Yes, I suppose I am. Perhaps after so many years of running from the past, I'm finally ready to face it." "What changed?" The question hung between them, simple yet profound. Kyle studied her face in the firelight, seeing there the honest curiosity of someone who had known her own share of loss and understood that pain, while isolating, did not have to be permanent. "You did," he said finally. "Your presence here has awakened things I thought long dead. Watching you tend your garden, listening to you hum while you work, seeing you create life and warmth in spaces that have known only emptiness, it's forced me to remember who I was before I became what I am." "And what are you, Kyle?" It was the question she had not dared ask directly, though it had haunted her thoughts since their first meeting. Kyle set down his goblet and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he studied the flames. "That is a conversation for another night, when you are stronger and better prepared for truths that may disturb your sleep more than any nightmare." Elira felt a sharp kick from the child within her, as if the baby too sensed the weight of unspoken revelations. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the solid reality of new life growing despite all the mysteries that surrounded her. "The child grows stronger each day," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Soon I'll need to prepare more seriously for the birth." Kyle's expression softened as he watched her gentle movements. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can provide?" "Knowledge would be helpful. I've delivered animals, but never a human child. In my village, there was always an older woman to guide the process, to share the wisdom passed down through generations. I may be able to help with that," Kyle said quietly. "I have some experience with childbirth, though it was gained long ago." Before Elira could ask him to elaborate, another sharp pain lanced through her lower back, more intense than any she had experienced before. She gasped, her hand flying to her side, and Kyle was beside her in an instant, moving with speed that seemed to blur the air between them. "What is it?" His voice carried an urgency that spoke of deep concern. "I don't know," Elira admitted, breathing carefully through the pain. "It feels different this time. Sharper." Kyle's hands hovered near her, clearly wanting to help but uncertain what assistance he could offer. "Perhaps you should rest. Let me help you back to your chambers." As he supported her weight, guiding her toward the stairs with careful steps, Elira noticed the way his touch seemed to calm the pain, as if his very presence had some healing quality. It was another mystery to add to the growing collection that surrounded him, but one she was grateful for in the moment. When they reached her chambers, Kael helped her settle into the large chair by the window, then moved to build up the fire, to chase away the night's chill. It was then that Elira noticed the chain around his neck, mostly hidden beneath his shirt, but occasionally visible when he moved. Something small and precious hung from it, catching the firelight when the angle was right. "What do you carry there?" she asked softly. Kael's hand went immediately to his throat, as if to hide what she had already seen. For a moment, she thought he would deflect the question, as he had so many others. But then, slowly, he drew out the chain and held up what hung from it. It was a locket, delicately wrought from silver, that had been worn smooth by centuries of handling. The surface was engraved with a pattern of roses and thorns, so fine and detailed that it might have been carved by fairy hands. But it was the care with which Kael held it, the reverence in his touch, that made Elira's breath catch. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand. After a long hesitation, Kael placed the locket in her palm. It was warm from his skin, heavier than its small size suggested, and when she found the tiny clasp and opened it, she saw a miniature portrait painted on ivory with breathtaking skill. The child in the portrait could not have been more than 5 years old, with dark curls and eyes that sparkled with mischief and joy. But it was the resemblance to Kael that made Elira's heart ache, the same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes, though these held only innocence and trust. "Your child," she whispered. Kael's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries of grief. "Her name was Liana. She would have been my daughter, if fate had been kinder. What happened to her? I failed to protect her from what I had become. The darkness that claimed me took her as well, in ways I have never forgiven myself for." Kael took the locket back, with hands that trembled slightly. "She was mortal, innocent, full of life and laughter, and I loved her more than my own existence." Elira felt tears gathering in her eyes, not just for the lost child, but for the man who had carried that loss for so long it had become part of his very being. How long ago? 200 years. 2 centuries of nights like this one, remembering her voice, her laugh, the way she would run to me with scraped knees and absolute faith that I could make everything better. The pain in his voice was so raw that Elira reached out instinctively, her hand covering his where it held the locket. She knew she was loved. Whatever else happened, she knew that. Kael's eyes, when he met her gaze, held a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I had forgotten that love, once given, becomes eternal. You've reminded me of that truth, Elira. Watching you prepare for your child, seeing the way you already love someone you've never met, it's awakened feelings I buried with her." "Love doesn't die," Elira said softly. "It transforms, but it never dies. Your Liana lives on in the man you became because of loving her, in the gentleness you've shown me, in the way you carved that cradle with such hope and tenderness." For the first time since she had known him, Kael allowed tears to fall, and Elira understood that she was witnessing the first cracks in a wall built of grief and self-recrimination that had stood for centuries. The ancient tome revealed itself to Elira quite by accident. While searching the vast library for books on midwifery and childbirth, hoping to find some guidance for the approaching birth, she had pulled a leather-bound volume from a high shelf, only to have several other books tumble down around her. One fell open at her feet, its pages yellowed with age, but still legible in the afternoon light that streamed through the library's tall windows. The text was written in multiple languages, some she recognized, and others that seemed to twist and shift when she looked at them directly. But the illustrations were unmistakable, pale figures with elongated canines, scenes of transformation under moonlight, and most disturbing of all, detailed accounts of creatures who walked the line between life and death. Vampire, she whispered, reading the ornate script that headed one particularly detailed chapter. The cursed ones who feast upon life. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, finding descriptions that seemed to leap from the text with horrible clarity. Here were beings who had traded their mortality for eternal existence, who sustained themselves on the blood of the living, who cast no reflection and feared the light of dawn. Yet interwoven with these frightening accounts were stranger passages, legends of redemption, of curses broken by unexpected love, of monsters who remembered their humanity and chose to reclaim it. I wondered when you would find that particular volume. Kael's voice from the library doorway made her start violently, the book nearly slipping from her grasp. He entered slowly, his movements carrying the fluid grace she had grown accustomed to, though now she understood it in a new and terrifying light. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you what this book describes?" Kael closed the library door behind him with careful deliberation, then moved to the window, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. Notably, Elira realized, he avoided the direct sunlight, keeping to the shadowed areas of the room. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Elira looked at him with new eyes, seeing details she had noticed, but not understood. His pale skin that seemed to glow with its own light, the way he moved with inhuman speed when startled or concerned, his apparent lack of need for sleep, food, or normal human comforts. Most tellingly, the way he had avoided mirrors throughout the castle, and how she had never seen his reflection in the windows they had passed together. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are something far older and more dangerous than any mortal man. And I think that you've been trying very hard not to frighten me with that truth. Are you frightened now?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that could destroy everything they had built together. Elira studied his face, seeing there not the monster described in the book's pages, but the man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had shared his deepest grief, who had tended a garden beside her with gentle hands. "I'm frightened of what this means," she admitted, "but not of you. Never of you." Kael's relief was visible, though it warred with something that might have been self-loathing. "You should be afraid. The things I've done, the lives I've taken to sustain my cursed existence, if you knew the full extent of it, you would run from this place and never look back. Perhaps. But I've learned that people are more than the worst things they've done. You saved me when no one else would. You've given me sanctuary, kindness, and hope when I had none. Whatever you were before, I know who you are now." Elira moved closer to him, the book still clutched in her hands. "But I need to understand something. This book speaks of redemption, of curses that can be broken. Is that possible? Can someone like you truly change?" Kael's laugh held bitter irony. "Legends and fairy tales, nothing more. I've searched for centuries for some way to reclaim what I lost, to become human again. If such redemption were possible, don't you think I would have found it by now? Maybe you were looking in the wrong places." The simple statement made Kael turn to face her fully. "What do you mean?" Elira opened the book to a passage she had marked with her finger, one written in a script that seemed more poetry than prose. "Listen to this. When the cursed one finds love that asks nothing in return, when innocence trusts without fear, when new life blooms in barren places, then may the ancient bonds be broken and the lost soul find its way home." "Pretty words," Kael said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. "Written by someone who never lived with the reality of eternal damnation, or written by someone who understood that damnation is often a choice we make for ourselves." Before Kael could respond, Elira gasped and doubled over, her hand flying to her belly as a wave of pain crashed through her. This was different from the earlier discomfort, sharper, more urgent, speaking of processes beginning that could not be stopped. "Elira!" Kael was beside her instantly, his arms supporting her weight as she breathed through the contraction. "I think," she managed between careful breaths. "The child has decided it's time." Kael's face went pale, paler than usual as the implications hit him. "Now? But it's too early. You said you had weeks yet. Babies come when they choose to come, not when it's convenient." Another wave of pain made her grip his arms tightly. "We need to get to the birthing chamber." "And Kael," she looked up at him with eyes that held both trust and desperation, "I'm going to need your help. Whatever you are, whatever you've been. Right now, I need you to be the man who carved that cradle with such love." As they made their way slowly toward the prepared chamber, each step punctuated by Elira's careful breathing through increasingly intense contractions, neither spoke of the deeper implications of what was happening. But both understood that this night would change everything between them. The birth of new life in a place that had known only death and emptiness for centuries. If the old legends held any truth, it might indeed be the catalyst for transformation that Kael had sought for so long. But first, they had to ensure that both mother and child survived the dangerous hours ahead. And as the sun set beyond the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Kael found himself praying to gods he had not spoken to in centuries, begging for the chance to protect the two souls who had become more precious to him than his own eternal existence. In the distance, though neither yet knew it, the village of Valdris buzzed with rumors of strange lights seen in the abandoned castle on the mountain. Father Marcus, a priest known for his fervent hatred of unholy things, had already begun gathering men brave enough to investigate what many whispered might be the lair of something that should not exist. The final test was approaching, though Kael's attention was focused entirely on the woman who had taught him to hope again, and the child who might hold the key to his salvation or his ultimate destruction. The labor progressed through the night with an intensity that left both Kael and Elira exhausted. The birthing chamber, carefully prepared with clean linens and warming fires, became a cocoon of focused effort as Elira worked to bring new life into the world. Kael, despite his centuries of existence, found himself helpless in the face of the ancient mystery of birth, able to offer only comfort and support as nature took its course. "Something's wrong," Elira gasped during a brief respite between contractions. Her face was pale with exhaustion, and Kael could hear the dangerous irregularity in her heartbeat that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. "What do you need me to do?" Kael asked, his usual composed demeanor cracked by genuine fear. In all his immortal existence, he had never felt so powerless, so desperate to help, yet unable to command the forces that threatened someone he had come to cherish. "The baby isn't positioned correctly," Elira explained through gritted teeth as another wave of pain began to build. "I can feel it. If this continues much longer," she didn't finish the sentence, but Kael understood the implications. He had witnessed enough death in his long existence to recognize when life hung by the thinnest of threads. The irony was not lost on him. He who had spent centuries dealing death might lose the two souls who had taught him the value of life. In desperation, Kael moved to the wash basin in the corner of the room, needing a moment to gather his thoughts and find some way to help. The ornate mirror above the basin had been covered with cloth at Elira's arrival, one of many precautions Kael had taken to hide his true nature. But in his distress, he pushed the fabric aside without thinking, seeking some sign of divine intervention in his reflection. And there, staring back at him from the silvered glass, was his own face. Kael stumbled backward, his immortal composure shattered by the impossible sight. For 800 years, mirrors had shown him nothing. The curse of vampirism had stolen not just his mortality, but his very image from the world. Yet now, as clear as starlight on water, his reflection gazed back at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Kael, what is it?" Elira called out, concern cutting through her pain as she noticed his sudden stillness. He turned back to her, his face transformed by wonder and terror in equal measure. "Elira, I can see myself. In the mirror I have a reflection. What does that mean?" But even as she asked, another contraction gripped her, demanding all her attention. Kael moved back to her side, his mind racing with implications he barely dared to consider. According to every legend he had ever studied, every ancient text that spoke of vampire curses, the return of a vampire's reflection could mean only one thing: the curse was breaking. But such transformation came with a price. As his immortal strength faded, he would become vulnerable to all the weaknesses of mortality, including the very real possibility of death. "It means," he said softly, taking her hand in his, "that love might be more powerful than any curse." Before Elira could ask him to elaborate, the sound of horses' hooves on stone echoed through the castle's courtyard. Kael's enhanced hearing, still functioning despite his apparent transformation, picked up the distinct clink of metal on metal, the purposeful movement of men who came prepared for war. "Someone's here," he said, moving to the window that overlooked the main approach to the castle. Below, torchlight revealed a group of perhaps 20 men, led by a figure in priest's robes, who carried what appeared to be a silver cross that gleamed with unnatural brightness. Father Marcus had come, as Kael had feared he might, drawn by rumors and suspicions that had finally overcome caution. "Vampire!" the priest's voice carried clearly through the night air. "We know you're in there, creature of darkness. Come out and face judgment for your crimes against God and man." Kael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. His reflection might have returned, but his transformation was far from complete. He still possessed enough vampiric strength to defend himself against mortal enemies, but with Elira in labor and unable to be moved, any conflict would put her and the child in mortal danger. Kael. Elira's voice was urgent, cutting through his strategic calculations. "Something's happening." He turned back to find her bearing down with renewed strength, her face set in fierce determination. And suddenly, miraculously, the child was coming properly positioned now, as if the universe had decided to offer one gift to balance the approaching threat. "I can see the head," Kael breathed, moving to assist, as he had seen done in distant memories of his mortal life. "Just a little more, Elira. You're so close." The sound of the castle's main doors splintering under the assault of the vampire hunters punctuated the final moments of the birth. As heavy footsteps echoed through the great hall below, as voices called out demands and threats, new life entered the world with a cry that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. The baby, a girl, perfect and whole, drew her first breath just as the hunting party's torches began to illuminate the corridors of the lower castle. Kael wrapped the infant in clean cloth, with hands that trembled not from vampiric hunger, but from overwhelming emotion, then placed her in Elira's exhausted but triumphant arms. "She's beautiful," Elira whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her daughter for the first time. "She's perfect." Kael looked down at the mother and child, at this miracle of new life that had emerged from a place of ancient death and darkness, and felt something fundamental shift within his very soul. The love he felt in that moment was so pure, so transformative, that it seemed to burn away centuries of darkness, like morning sun dispelling night. And in that moment of perfect clarity, he understood what was happening to him. The old legends spoke truth, love freely given, innocence trusted without fear, new life blooming in barren places. All the conditions for breaking the vampire's curse had been fulfilled, not through magic or ritual, but through the simple power of human connection. But transformation came with vulnerability. As his immortal strength continued to ebb, as his supernatural senses dimmed to merely human levels, the approaching hunters represented a threat he might no longer be able to face with his usual advantages. "They've found us," he said quietly, hearing the heavy footsteps climbing the tower stairs. "The hunters are in the castle." Elira looked up from her newborn daughter, her eyes still bright with the exhaustion and triumph of childbirth, but now shadowed with new fear. "What do they want?" Justice, as they see it. They believe I'm a monster who needs to be destroyed. Kyle moved to the chamber's heavy door, checking the bolt that would provide only temporary protection. They're not entirely wrong, but they don't understand that monsters can sometimes find their way back to the light. The baby's soft cries filled the chamber, a sound of such pure innocence that it seemed to make the very stones of the ancient castle remember what hope felt like. And as the hunters' voices grew closer, as torchlight began to flicker under the chamber door, Kyle made a decision that would define not just his fate, but the future of the small family that had become more precious to him than eternal life itself. He would not run. He would not hide behind the fading remnants of his supernatural power. Instead, he would face his accusers as a man flawed, mortal, but redeemed by love and transformed by the trust of two innocent souls who had seen past his darkness to the humanity he had thought forever lost. The test of his redemption was about to begin. The silver cross that Kyle discovered among his personal effects should have burned his flesh like molten metal. For 8 centuries, such holy symbols had been instruments of agony, capable of inflicting wounds that healed slowly and left scars on both body and soul. Yet now, as he lifted the small crucifix from the wooden box where he had hidden it away, the silver felt merely cool against his palm-blessed metal that spoke of protection rather than punishment. "Another sign," he murmured, understanding with growing certainty that his transformation was accelerating beyond anything the ancient texts had described. The returned reflection had been just the beginning. Now, as the baby's cries echoed through the chamber and the hunters' voices grew louder in the corridors below, he was becoming something he had not been for centuries: human. Kyle. Elira's voice was weak but urgent. She had managed to sit up despite her exhaustion, the newborn cradled protectively in her arms. "What are you planning to do?" He turned to face her, and she saw in his expression a resolve that mixed determination with something that looked remarkably like peace. "I'm going to meet them. I'm going to tell them the truth. They'll kill you." The statement was simple and terrible in its certainty. "Perhaps, but hiding will only endanger you and the child. They know I'm here, they won't leave until they find me. Better to face them on my terms than to be cornered like a beast." Kyle moved to the window, observing the hunters who had positioned themselves strategically around the castle's courtyard. Father Marcus stood at their center, his silver cross catching the torchlight like a beacon of righteous fury. The priest's face, even from this distance, showed the fervor of a man who believed himself to be doing God's work by hunting creatures of darkness. "There's something you need to know," Kyle said, turning back to Elira with an expression that mixed love with regret. "If the worst happens, if they manage to destroy me, there's a letter in the desk drawer. It explains everything about the castle, about resources I've gathered over the centuries. You'll have enough to live comfortably, to give the child a good life, far from here." Elira's eyes filled with tears. "Don't talk as if you're already dead. You said yourself that love can break curses, that redemption is possible. Fight for it, Kyle. Fight for us." "I am fighting," he said softly, moving to kneel beside her chair. "For the first time in 8 centuries, I'm fighting for something more precious than my own existence." He reached out to gently touch the baby's tiny hand, marveling at the perfection of those miniature fingers. "What will you name her?" "Hope," Elira said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." Kyle smiled, the first truly radiant expression Elira had seen from him. "Perfect. She is hope incarnate, proof that even in the darkest places, new life can take root and flourish." The sound of splintering wood echoed from somewhere in the castle's lower levels, followed by shouted orders and the clank of weapons. The hunters had breached the inner defenses and were now searching room by room, methodically working their way toward the upper towers, where they sensed their quarry waited. Kyle stood and moved to a small writing desk in the corner of the chamber. His hands moved quickly, pen scratching across parchment as he composed what might be his final words. The letter was brief but comprehensive, outlining his love for both Elira and her child, his gratitude for the redemption they had unknowingly offered, and practical instructions for the life they might build if he did not survive the coming confrontation. Ka'el. Elira's voice stopped him as he sealed the letter. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll remember that you're no longer the monster you once believed yourself to be. When you face them, remember that you're a man who carved a cradle with love, who tended a garden to help herbs grow, who held my hand through the darkest hours of labor. You're the man who gave sanctuary to someone who had nowhere else to turn. Ka'el folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer, then returned to her side. I will remember, he promised, leaning down to kiss her forehead gently. And I'll remember that love, real, transformative love, is worth any sacrifice. The baby stirred in Elira's arms, her tiny face scrunching as she adjusted to the world beyond the womb. Ka'el looked down at her, this small miracle who had entered the world at the exact moment his own transformation had begun, and felt a surge of protectiveness so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. Father Marcus, Ka'el called out, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient stone corridors. I know you're searching for me. There's no need to destroy my home or endanger innocent lives. I'll come to you. The sounds of searching stopped abruptly, replaced by hurried whispers and the shuffle of men taking defensive positions. Father Marcus's voice boomed back, amplified by the castle's acoustics. Show yourself, creature of darkness. Face the judgment you've avoided for so long. Ka'el looked one final time at Elira and the child, memorizing their faces in case this was the last moment of peace he would know. Then he moved toward the chamber door, pausing with his hand on the heavy bolt. Whatever happens, he said quietly, know that these past weeks with you have been the most human I've felt since my transformation. You saved me, Elira, long before I ever saved you. Then don't let that salvation be wasted, she replied firmly. Come back to us. Come back to the life we can build together. Ka'el unbolted the door and stepped into the corridor, leaving behind the warmth and light of the chamber for the uncertain darkness of the castle's ancient halls. As he descended the twisting stairs toward the great hall, where he could hear the hunters waiting, each step felt like a deliberate choice, not just to face his accusers, but to embrace fully the humanity that love had restored to him. His reflection in the polished surfaces he passed was clear and strong now, showing a man rather than a monster, someone who had found his way back from the abyss through the simple power of caring for others. The silver cross in his palm remained cool and comforting, a tangible reminder that he was no longer the creature Father Marcus expected to find. Behind him, barely audible through the thick stone walls, he could hear Hope's soft cries and Elira's gentle voice singing a lullaby. It was a sound that filled him with more strength than all his supernatural powers ever had, the knowledge that he had helped bring new life into the world, that he had provided sanctuary when it was desperately needed, that he had loved and been loved in return. The great hall came into view, its ancient grandeur now illuminated by the harsh torchlight of 20 armed men who had come to destroy what they did not understand. At their center stood Father Marcus, his silver cross held high, his face set in lines of righteous determination. But Ka'el no longer saw enemies to be fought or overcome. He saw frightened men doing what they believed was right, following teachings that painted the world in absolute terms of good and evil, light and darkness. They could not know that love had already won this battle, that redemption had already transformed the very creature they sought to destroy. As Ka'el stepped into the great hall, his hands empty of weapons, his posture conveying peace rather than threat, he understood that the true test was not whether he could survive this confrontation. The test was whether he could face these men with the compassion and understanding that his restored humanity demanded, whether he could show them that transformation was possible even for those they deemed irredeemable. The silver cross in his palm caught the torchlight, gleaming like a beacon of hope in the darkness, not because it could repel evil, but because it represented the possibility that even the most lost souls could find their way home. The silence that greeted Kyle's entrance into the great hall was profound, broken only by the soft crackle of torches and the barely audible echo of Hope's first cry, drifting down from the tower above. 20 armed men stood in formation, their weapons gleaming in the flickering light, yet none moved to attack immediately. Something in Kyle's bearing the calm acceptance in his posture, the absence of the predatory menace they had expected, gave them pause. Father Marcus stepped forward, his silver cross raised like a weapon, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Vampire, we have come to end your reign of terror, to cleanse this cursed place of your unholy presence." Kyle remained still, his hands visible and empty, making no threatening gestures, despite the obvious hostility surrounding him. "Father Marcus," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall, "you've traveled far and brought many good men into danger, but I must tell you the creature you seek no longer exists." "Lies," the priest spat, though his eyes showed confusion at Kyle's unexpected calm. "You are an abomination, a creature of darkness that feeds upon the innocent. We have reports of lights in this accursed place, evidence of your unholy activities." "You have reports of new life," Kyle corrected gently, "of a child born not an hour ago, brought safely into the world, despite the dangers that threatened both mother and infant." From above, as if summoned by his words, Hope's cry rang out again, clear, strong, and unmistakably alive. Several of the hunters exchanged uncertain glances, their weapons wavering slightly as the sound registered in their consciousness. "A child?" Father Marcus's certainty faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed fury. "What blasphemy is this? What innocent have you corrupted with your evil presence?" "No corruption," Kyle said, taking a single step forward despite the weapons trained upon him. "Only sanctuary offered to someone who had nowhere else to turn. A pregnant woman, abandoned by her village, with no hope except what little kindness might be found in an unlikely place." He could see doubt beginning to creep into some of the hunters' faces, uncertainty replacing the righteous anger that had brought them up the mountain. But Father Marcus remained unmoved, his faith in absolute evil too strong to be shaken by mere words. "Enough," the priest commanded. "Whatever deceptions you spin, whatever lies you tell, you cannot hide what you are. We know the stories, vampire. We know the trail of death you've left across the centuries." "You're right," Kyle said simply, his admission stunning the assembled men into silence. "I have killed. I have taken life to sustain my cursed existence. I have done terrible things that cannot be undone or forgiven." The honesty in his voice, the complete absence of denial or justification, created a ripple of confusion through the hunting party. This was not the defiant monster they had expected to face, not the snarling beast that would rage against their accusations. "Then you admit your guilt," Father Marcus said, though his voice carried less triumph than uncertainty. "You confess to your crimes against humanity." "I confess to what I was," Kyle replied, his hand moving slowly to reveal the silver cross in his palm. "But I also bear witness to what I have become." The sight of the holy symbol resting comfortably in the vampire's hand sent a shock through the assembled hunters. Several stepped back instinctively, their understanding of the natural order challenged by what their eyes showed them. Father Marcus stared at the cross, his own silver symbol trembling in his grasp. "Impossible," the priest whispered. "The blessed silver should burn you, should cause you agony beyond endurance." "It did, for 8 centuries, Kyle agreed, "until love taught me that redemption was possible, that even the most lost souls could find their way back to the light." "Trickery!" Father Marcus rallied, though his voice lacked its previous conviction. Some dark magic designed to fool us into lowering our guard. From the tower above, a new voice joined the confrontation. Elira's weak from childbirth but strong with desperate love. Please, he speaks the truth. He saved me when no one else would, gave me sanctuary when I had nowhere to turn. The man you seek to destroy helped bring new life into the world. The hunters looked upward toward the source of the voice, their faces showing confusion and growing doubt. This was not the scenario they had prepared for, not the clear battle between good and evil that their faith demanded. She lies, Father Marcus insisted, but even he seemed less certain now. She has been corrupted by his influence, made into his servant. Then let her speak for herself, Kyle suggested quietly. Let her tell her own story, and judge for yourselves whether love or corruption brought her to this place. The offer hung in the air like morning mist, delicate but potentially transformative. For the first time since entering the castle, the hunters faced the possibility that their mission might be based on incomplete understanding, that redemption might indeed be possible for even the most damned souls. Father Marcus gripped his silver cross tighter, his knuckles white with the strain of holding on to certainties that were beginning to crumble around him. The next moments would determine whether faith could expand to encompass the possibility of transformation, or whether fear and rigid doctrine would demand blood regardless of evidence to the contrary. The standoff stretched taut as bowstring until one of the younger hunters, a man whose face bore the earnest conviction of youth, stepped forward with his sword drawn. "Enough talk," he declared, his voice shaking slightly with nervous energy. "If he truly is what he claims to have become, let him prove it. Let his blood reveal the truth." Father Marcus opened his mouth to object, but the young man was already in motion, his blade cutting a shallow line across Kyle's outstretched palm before anyone could intervene. The assembled hunters held their collective breath, expecting to see the dark, corrupted blood of the undead flow from the wound. Instead, what flowed was as red as summer roses, as human as their own. The drop of blood that fell to the ancient stone floor gleamed in the torchlight with the deep crimson of mortal life. Not the black ichor of vampire curse, not the pale fluid of the undead, but blood that spoke of a heart that beat with human rhythm, of veins that carried life rather than borrowed death. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," whispered one of the older hunters, his weapon lowering involuntarily as he stared at the crimson proof pooled on the floor. Father Marcus stumbled backward, his silver cross now trembling so violently that its light danced like captured starshine across the hall's ancient walls. "This cannot be," he breathed, his voice hollow with disbelief. "The scriptures speak of no redemption for the damned, no return from the curse of vampirism." "Perhaps," Kale said gently, pressing a cloth to his wounded palm. "The scriptures were written by men who had never witnessed love strong enough to transform even the darkest soul. Perhaps redemption has always been possible, waiting only for someone to believe in it strongly enough to make it real." From the tower above, Elira's voice carried down once more, though weaker now as exhaustion from childbirth took its toll. "Please," she called, her words barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I was desperate, abandoned, with nowhere to turn. He could have taken advantage of my helplessness, could have used my desperation for his own dark purposes. Instead, he gave me sanctuary, kindness, and hope for my child's future. If that is the work of a monster, then perhaps we need to reconsider what monsters truly are." The young hunter who had drawn Kyle's blood stared at the weapon in his hands as if seeing it for the first time. "The blood doesn't lie," he said quietly. "Whatever he was before, he bleeds as we do now." Father Marcus's face contorted with the struggle between doctrine and evidence, between the absolute certainties that had guided his life and the impossible transformations standing before him. "Even if this is true," he said desperately, "even if some miracle has occurred, what of his past crimes? What of the lives he took during his cursed existence? Must there not be justice?" Kael nodded slowly, understanding the priest's dilemma. "You're right to ask for justice, Father. I have spent centuries trying to find some way to atone for the darkness I spread, the lives I took. But I've learned that true justice sometimes lies not in punishment, but in transformation. Not in destroying what was, but in nurturing what could be." He gestured toward the tower, where Elira and Hope waited. "That woman and her child represent the future I choose to build, the light I choose to serve. If you must have my life as payment for my past sins, I offer it willingly, but only if you swear to protect them, to ensure they have safe passage from this place to build the life they deserve." The offer hung in the air like incense, sacred and transformative. Several of the hunters exchanged meaningful glances, their faces showing the internal struggle between the mission they had come to complete and the reality they now faced. It was Father Marcus who finally broke the silence, his voice carrying the weight of a man forced to confront the limitations of his own understanding. "You would die to protect them? A mortal woman and child you've known for mere weeks?" Without hesitation, Kyle replied simply, "Love does not measure its worth by time or convenience. It exists in the willingness to sacrifice for another's welfare, in the choice to value someone else's life above your own. If that is not proof enough of redemption, then perhaps redemption itself is beyond human understanding." The priest stared at Kyle for a long moment, seeing not the monster he had expected to find, but a man whose transformation seemed to shine from within, like candlelight, through clear glass. Around him, his followers waited for guidance, their certainties as shaken as his own. "Lower your weapons," Father Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Father?" the young hunter questioned, uncertainty clear in his tone. "I said lower your weapons," the priest repeated, more firmly this time. "We came here to destroy a monster, but the creature we sought no longer exists. What stands before us now is a man who has found his way back from damnation through love, and perhaps that is a greater miracle than any destruction we might accomplish." The silver cross in Father Marcus's hand caught the torchlight, one final time as he slowly lowered it, no longer a weapon of judgment, but a symbol of the mercy that could transform even the most hardened hearts. 3 months later, the mountain castle had transformed as completely as its master. Where once cold stone corridors had echoed with emptiness, now warmth and laughter filled every room. Elira's herb garden flourished behind the castle walls, its neat rows of medicinal plants testament to her gentle care, and the rich mountain soil that had needed only patient tending to remember its purpose. The sound of Hope's contented coos drifted through windows that no longer needed to remain shuttered against unwelcome light. Kyle stood in the nursery, the tower room, where he had once kept an empty cradle as a monument to lost dreams, watching his wife tend to their daughter. The legal ceremony had been simple, conducted by Father Marcus himself 3 weeks prior, a gesture of atonement that had surprised them all. The priest had remained in the valley below, establishing a small chapel where he could minister to travelers and contemplate the lessons learned about redemption and the infinite possibilities of divine grace. "She's growing so quickly," Elira observed, lifting Hope from the beautifully carved cradle that now served its intended purpose at last. The baby had her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle spirit, with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom and innocence the world could offer. Kyle smiled, moving to place his arms around his wife and child in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing, though breathing itself was still a wonder he did not take for granted. Mortality had returned to him completely, bringing with it all the vulnerabilities and joys of human existence. He felt hunger and thirst, fatigue and the deep satisfaction of restful sleep. Most precious of all, he felt the steady rhythm of his own heart, beating in time with those of the 2 souls who had saved him from centuries of living death. "The village council sent another messenger yesterday," Elira said, settling into the rocking chair Kyle had crafted with his own hands during the long autumn evenings. They're requesting your assistance with the new irrigation system for their fields. Kael nodded, still marveling at the transformation in the local villagers' attitude toward their mountain neighbor. What had once been fear and suspicion had gradually given way to cautious respect, then genuine appreciation, as Kael used his centuries of accumulated knowledge to help solve practical problems that had plagued the region for generations. His understanding of engineering, agriculture, and medicine, gathered from ages of observation and study, proved invaluable to communities struggling with the harsh realities of mountain life. "I'll ride down tomorrow to meet with them," he agreed, then paused to study his reflection in the window glass. Even after months, the sight of his own image still filled him with quiet wonder. The face that looked back at him was older now, marked with the subtle lines that came from genuine laughter and the kind of worry that spoke of caring deeply for others' welfare. It was a human face, mortal and therefore precious in its impermanence. "Do you ever regret it?" Elira asked softly, following his gaze to the reflection. "Giving up immortality, trading eternal existence for a normal human lifespan?" Kael turned to look at her directly, his expression holding all the love and certainty that 8 centuries of searching had finally rewarded him with. "How could I regret the chance to truly live? I existed for 800 years, but I've only been alive since the day I found you at that auction block." Hope stirred in her mother's arms, making the small sounds that had become the sweetest music either parent had ever heard. Kael reached out to stroke his daughter's soft cheek, marveling once again at the miracle of her existence. This tiny being represented everything he had thought lost forever: the future, hope, the continuation of love beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. "Besides," he added with a gentle smile, "mortality is not a curse when it's shared with the people who make life worth living. Every day, with you and hope, is worth centuries of empty existence." A knock at the castle's main door echoed through the corridors below, not the violent pounding of enemies, but the courteous announcement of welcome visitors. Through the window, they could see a small party approaching on horseback. Father Marcus and several of the hunters who had once come seeking Kael's destruction, now arriving for their weekly visit to check on the unusual family that had challenged everything they thought they knew about redemption. "I'll go greet them," Kael said, pressing a kiss to Elira's forehead and another to Hope's tiny hand. "I believe Father Marcus mentioned he wanted to discuss plans for the new school." As he descended the castle's ancient stairs, Kael reflected on the profound changes that love had brought, not just to his own existence, but to the entire community. The former vampire hunters had become unlikely friends, men who had learned that true courage sometimes lay in questioning old certainties and embracing new possibilities. Father Marcus's theological discussions had evolved from rigid doctrine to thoughtful exploration of mercy's infinite potential. In the great hall where he had once faced judgment and expected death, Kael now welcomed guests with genuine warmth. The same room that had witnessed his transformation from monster to man now served as a gathering place for neighbors and friends, filled with the simple human pleasures of conversation, shared meals, and planning for a future bright with possibility. Through the tall windows, afternoon sunlight, no longer something to be feared but embraced, painted golden patterns on the stone floors. And there, on the small table near the fireplace, sat a simple sketch that Elira had drawn just that morning, Kael holding Hope in his arms while she slept, both faces peaceful with the contentment that came from love freely given and joyfully received. It was a family portrait in the truest sense, capturing not just their physical likenesses, but the profound transformation that had turned a castle of shadows into a home filled with light. The drawing would fade with time, as mortal things must, but the love it represented had already proven itself stronger than any curse, more enduring than any magic. In choosing mortality, Kael had gained immortality of a different kind, the eternal nature of love that continues beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime, passed from parent to child, from heart to heart, from darkness into the everlasting light of hope, reborn.